and it's not going to be a fair process. And in fact, the governor has been given no process. I think that women should be believed, and they should be treated fairly. I also believe that men should be believed and treated fairly.
Anna, on this idea of due process, are her claims something that could also be investigated in the future? And what legal paths could Cuomo seek out in order to try and prove he was not given due process?
Well, certainly the report from James was not a trial. It was not, she did not recommend anything specific other than saying these are the facts as I found them. And even the Assembly Impeachment Committee said that they would be looking at that in accordance with other details that they ultimately would find themselves. It's unclear whether or not that will go forward, but that it wasn't a be-all, end-all necessarily, and I don't think that anyone was treating it that way, except for perhaps the governor's office, which was saying that because so many decisions, so many calls for resignation were based on that, it was ultimately taken that way, whether or not that was the full, the actual legal intent of it.
And Alyssa, as we mentioned, Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul will replace Cuomo in 2 weeks. She will be the first female governor of New York State. What more can you tell us about her as a leader, and how has she been preparing for this transition?
Yeah, so, Hochul was not Cuomo's first lieutenant governor, but she joined him in 2015 and, worked very closely with Cuomo, even though she's elected separately by the voters of New York. And he particularly and I say he would deploy her because very much she kind of worked under Cuomo's shadow and in coordination with Cuomo's agenda. She largely traveled around the state, especially to upstate regions, and she is from Buffalo, briefly represented an area in Buffalo in Congress, and so she often visited upstate. She also worked a lot, and I think this is very significant, on Cuomo's efforts that date back years to really position himself as a feminist, pro-woman governor. He very quickly after she had joined, she, toured the state to promote Cuomo's anti-campus sexual assault agenda, attended movie screenings with him of a documentary that was produced by his sister about campus sexual assault. And so she was very much kind of Cuomo's face often on women's issues. And that's a powerful irony given how she's coming into office now.
Yeah, a powerful irony indeed. And Anna, what kind of impact could Cuomo's resignation and Kathy Hochul's new role have on the New York State Democratic Party as a whole?
I think it will be a very interesting shift, a very interesting scramble even now, because people who were considering potentially jumping into a primary might think about the whole situation very differently if it would be against a Governor Kathy Hochul. We don't necessarily know if she would be the nominee, and there's a shifting, a domino effect, I guess, among politicians. If someone decides to run for one office, another one opens up, and so it could be a completely different ballgame without Cuomo in the mix. And I think it's also going to be interesting. Republicans were gunning for their chance, maybe. They thought that Cuomo was wounded enough that maybe they would have a shot at the executive mansion this year. If they're not running their nominee, Lee Zeldin, or presumptive nominee against Andrew Cuomo, again, the strategy might look completely different.
Yeah, Alyssa, what's your take on all of that? I mean, a moment ago, you talked about sort of chess pieces now quickly moving around with Governor Cuomo's announcement that he plans to resign. What can we now expect, you think, to see during next year's gubernatorial election?
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting to see how it shakes out, because certainly kind of mainstream Democrats have declined repeatedly to challenge Andrew Cuomo, just simply in part given the size of his campaign war chest, right? He raised millions of dollars off of business interests who, were dealing with the state. And in fact, entanglements with some of those donors led to the corruption conviction of one of his top aides, Joe Percoco, who is currently in prison. So, with all of that money and power kind of swept aside, It's kind of an open field. But I can say, one name that's very interesting here is Attorney General Letitia James. Let's keep in mind that Cuomo himself was Attorney General before he became governor. And, during James's investigation, or the investigation she oversaw, Cuomo and his team repeatedly accused her of being motivated by politics and saying that she wanted his office and that's why she's trying to ruin him, basically. And now she's in the position of being quite popular with voters. There was a poll about who voters might want to see as the next governor, and she ranked very high on that. And now she, is in the position of quite possibly running while not playing into that narrative that Cuomo had laid out, that she was just gunning for him the whole time.
Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating to see how all of this plays out. Certainly a seismic shift in New York State politics. Alyssa Katz and Anna Grenewald, thank you both. Good to have you. President Biden says he respects the governor's decision to resign in response to a question on his assessment of the Democratic leader's time leading the state of New York. The president said Mr. Cuomo had, quote, done one hell of a job. Those comments came during the president's remarks applauding the passage of $1 trillion infrastructure bill in the Senate. 19 Republicans joined the entire Democratic caucus to pass the bipartisan measure. President Biden says it will make key investments in physical infrastructure upgrades across America.
This historic investment infrastructure is what I believe you, the American people, want. What you've been asking for a long, long time. This bill shows that we can work together. I want to thank those senators who worked so hard to bring this agreement together. I know it wasn't easy. For the Republicans who supported this bill, you showed a lot of courage. And I want to personally thank you for that. For the Democrats who supported this bill, we can be proud of this unprecedented investments that are going to transform the nation and change millions of lives for the better.
The bill includes $550 billion in new spending. That includes funds for road, rail, and public transit projects. It also aims to improve clean energy, drinking water, and broadband access. For more, let's bring in Nancy Cordes and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Nancy is CBS News Chief White House Correspondent, and Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter. Welcome to you both. On any other day, I would lead off with a question on infrastructure, given what's taken place. But Caitlin, I have to start with Andrew Cuomo, whose resignation our Ed O'Keefe asked President Biden about Tuesday afternoon. Let's listen to some of that.
Ironically, one of the Democrats through the years that you spoke with about infrastructure the most was Andrew Cuomo, who is resigning, who announced he's resigning today. You had traveled to New York with him when you were vice president to the launch of the reconstruction of LaGuardia. He was someone who supported your campaign early on. No, you called on him to resign. No, you condemned the alleged behavior. But you're someone who spends a lot of time with mayors and governors. How would you assess his 10.5 years as governor of the state?
In terms of his personal behavior or what he's done as a governor?
What he's done as a governor.
I thought he's done a hell of a job. And both on everything from access to voting to infrastructure, to a whole range of things. That's why it's so sad.
So the governor's announced resignation came shortly after his personal attorney, Rita Glavin, appeared in front of the state seal, objecting to Attorney General Letitia James's report. Cuomo himself then said the situation and moment were not about the facts. Caitlin, what's your take of the governor's strategy?
Well, kudos to Ed, too, for finding that intersection between those big stories today. What's significant about the governor's announcement today is, on one hand, he was saying that he takes full responsibility for his actions. On the other hand, he was saying that this report by the attorney general is entirely political. I don't think those two can be the same thing at once. But look, the writing was absolutely on the wall. The reality was that Cuomo was facing an impeachment proceedings about this and likely to be removed removed from office by his colleagues. There had been reporting, including from our own team, that Democrats were likely to move forward with voting yes on impeachment. And so the writing was certainly on the wall. As we reported earlier this year, the things that we were looking for to see whether Cuomo would eventually resign, in addition to what came of this report, was whether he could maintain a coalition of support, not only in polling, but also a coalition of supporters within the Democratic Party in his state. And he lost on all measures. So we saw the polling falter, and we also saw that he had no allies left in the Democratic Party in his state, no allies left in the Democratic Party in the congressional delegation, and that was significant. So it was just an untenable position for him politically, and also it allows him to resign without having an extra, asterisk next to his name of that impeachment inquiry. But it also kind of shows the broader impact that it could have threatened to have continuously on the Democratic Party. I mean, you mentioned that on any other day we would be talking about infrastructure first. This was supposed to be a day of celebration at the White House for actually passing a long-awaited infrastructure bill with bipartisan support out of the Senate, and instead the focus was on Andrew Cuomo's resignation. And also this comes as Democrats have spent the past several years in the Me Too movement trying to establish the moral high ground on these issues, and the longer that this continued to go on, the longer that put Democrats, beyond New York, in a very difficult and perhaps hypocritical position. And so that's why you saw all of these calls for his resignation. But again, could have had broader impacts for the party. And we should also note that there could still be some criminal and legal liabilities left for the governor, even as he leaves office.
That's a really important point to note. And Nancy, Governor Cuomo and President Biden have known each other for decades. Can you talk a bit more about that relationship and how the sexual harassment scandal and other issues that have come to light have impacted that relationship?
Sure. I mean, they have been political allies. They have been at the upper echelon of the Democratic Party apparatus for so many years, and they've worked so closely, most recently on COVID. Andrew Cuomo, until very recently, was the leader of the National Governors Association, and as such, he led these weekly phone calls with top White House COVID officials for months as they worked through this pandemic. But it goes beyond politics as well. President Biden has been very candid in the past about how much he admired Andrew Cuomo's father, Mario Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo was the Attorney General of New York State at the same time that President Biden's late son, Beau, was the Attorney General of Delaware, so they knew each other. Andrew Cuomo was at Beau's funeral and embraced President Biden there. So they've known each other both in political and personal circles for many years. Juxtapose that with what we've seen over the past few weeks at the White House, if not the past few months, where Andrew Cuomo has really basically become persona non grata. Whenever the White House press secretary was asked about him, she made it very clear there was no contact between the governor of New York and the president of the United States, and that there wasn't even much contact, at least when it comes to this issue, between Andrew Cuomo's top aides and top officials at the White House. They were really looking to distance themselves as much as possible from Cuomo. And while the president still had warm words in that answer to Ed about the job that Cuomo had done more broadly over the past decade as governor of New York, when you talk to officials about Cuomo, officials at the White House, they don't mince words. They've been very tough on him, both privately and at the White House podium, about what they think about the allegations against him.
Right, because if I'm remembering correctly, after that question that Ed asked and that the president answered, I think there may have been an attempt or two by other reporters to follow up on Andrew Cuomo, and President Biden made very clear he was not interested in further addressing that topic. But Caitlin, let's go ahead and turn to infrastructure. What is included in this bipartisan bill that senators passed today, and what were some of the last-minute deals made?
That's right. So over $550 billion in new spending. That includes $66 billion for rail and transportation, $55 billion for improving water infrastructure, $65 billion for improving broadband internet. That was something that we've been covering a lot, access to broadband and expanding that. About $7 billion to build electric vehicle charging stations. That's less than what the president had wanted. And about $15 billion as well to replace lead pipes, and the president mentioned that today, referring to the Flint water crisis as an example. So there was a lot of last-minute haggling over lots of details. We know that there were lots of late-night dinners, late-night chats, trying to get the necessary support for this kind of deal. There was some last-minute haggling around the how to tax cryptocurrency, for example. But the biggest sticking point, as we've been talking about for the past few months, had been kind of how to actually pay for this bill. And they ended up being able to put in a provision to repurpose some COVID relief funds as part of this. But and there was a nonpartisan analysis that said that this would generate over $50 billion in revenue over the next decade. But the CBO report also said that it would add a couple of $1 billion to the deficit. And that ended up being something that spooked Republican lawmakers. We even saw some Republicans who had worked on the bipartisan negotiations earlier in the process not support this deal in the end. We also saw Republicans who voted to proceed on the measure not support this bill at the end. We know that former President Trump, of course, was really critical of this bill, had been urging Republicans to vote against it. We saw that lots of, near 19 Republicans ended up voting for it. But the breakdown is really interesting there, because on one hand, you had significant support from someone like Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader. You also had support from Lindsey Graham, a close ally of the former president. But most of the Republicans who ended up supporting this bill, aren't in difficult political positions. Many of them had been already reelected comfortably. We did see, however, that McConnell's leadership team voted against this bill, and others citing that CBO report and also the attachment of this bill to the larger reconciliation bill was something that came up. So a big accomplishment certainly for this White House, but of course still facing some uphill climbs over in the House.
And Nancy, this bipartisan bill now moves to the House. So what do we know about its potential fate there?
What we know is that it's probably going to sit there for a while, Elaine, because Democrats, progressive Democrats in the House in particular, have made it clear they are not going to vote to pass this bipartisan measure unless it is paired with a much larger Democratic bill that's still being written in the Senate that is many times the size of the bill that just passed the House, that deals with everything else in President Biden's agenda when it comes to working families, that they feel should have been in this bipartisan plan but isn't. That's going to be somewhere in the range of $3.5 trillion. And House Democrats are very nervous that if they go ahead and pass this bipartisan plan now, then they lose their leverage to try to push this massive spending package through in a few months. They won't be able to sort of use the bipartisan plan as a bargaining chip. So they say they're going to wait. It's very unclear whether that strategy is going to work. There are still some moderate Senate Democrats like Joe Manchin of West Virginia, like Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who were pivotal in moving this bipartisan plan through the Senate, who are somewhat lukewarm at the best of times about this much larger Democratic package. But you're going to need all Democrats on board in order to move the larger package through the House and then through the Senate. And so chances are, while we have seen this bipartisan plan overcome a major hurdle by passing in the Senate with as large of a majority as it did, now things are going to slow down considerably through August, when the House and Senate will not be here in Washington, as the Senate continues to write this major Democratic package, and then Democrats try to push both bills through the House and Senate in the fall.
All right. Finally, Nancy, on Tuesday afternoon, President Biden addressed some of the tensions over mask mandates and discussed a recent phone call with Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. What did he say?
He basically said that he had spoken to Governor Hutchinson on Monday, and they talked about rising COVID rates in his state. It's a red state. Governor Hutchinson is a Republican, and he offered any other resources that the federal government could possibly provide to Arkansas to help with the COVID situation there. Now, you might be wondering, why is the White House highlighting this one particular call with this one particular governor? The president surely speaks to governors from both parties all the time. Well, the message there was clear. The president is not happy with the way that some other Republicans have been handling COVID in their states, most notably Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, Governor Greg Abbott in Texas. But the White House has been full of praise for the way Asa Hutchinson in Arkansas has been handling the pandemic, because they say he is following CDC guidelines much more closely than these other Republican governors. And so this was meant to send a message. Hey, if we feel that you're following the science, if you are doing things that we believe are responsible, then the federal coffers will be open to you. We will do whatever we can do to help you with the COVID situation in your state. This is a recognition, Elaine, that while they may have some carrots at their disposal, the federal government doesn't have a lot of sticks when it comes to forcing DeSantis or Abbott to change course when it comes to things like prohibiting schools from imposing their own mask mandates. The president said he's looking into what kind of powers the federal government has to punish DeSantis for doing this. But the fact that he's still looking all this many weeks later shows that probably those sticks are very difficult to find.
Hence the debate and the rhetoric certain to continue. Nancy Cordes and Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you both very much. The Taliban is continuing to gain ground as U.S. troops withdraw from Afghanistan. How the terrorist organization is convincing the Afghan army to retreat from major cities as the U.S. pushes for a ceasefire. Plus, why House Democrats are going to have to wait for former President Trump's tax returns. Stay with us. You're streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News.
This is what fire crews are up against.
Breaking news streaming all day long.
And always just a click away.
The highest quality journalism
that explains not just who or what or where,
but why.
CBS News. This is why.
Good evening from our CBS newsroom in New York.
From the very beginning, CBS News has looked for new ways to reach people.
Today, that mission to tell the story of all our lives is stronger than ever.
It's important that we remember the story correctly.
A smart start to the day with facts first.
Unbiased reporting, making sense of our world every evening.
Who's responsible?
We found one hell of a story of survival.
CBS News. This is why.
Did you know CBSN has 11 local streams from coast to coast? You can watch wherever you are. Just download the free CBS News app or check us out on all your favorite platforms. We're